just quickly share my screen. It is quite a difficult task to actually follow such great scholars who have spoken on this topic, but I hope to be able to speak on something which might be, from a focus point of view, slightly different, and therefore, hopefully, something new and interesting as well. Now, the title of my presentation for today is Beyond Etymology, Nirukta's Significance for Global Histories of Science, Technology, and Indian History of Writing and Knowledge Systems. This presentation is based on two papers that I wrote in 2020. They were Reading Yāska's Nirukta in 2020, Jottings of Consequence, The Global History of Astronomy, Yāska's Chronological Epoch, and Indic History of Writing and Knowledge Systems. And the second one being A Case for a Place for Yāska's Nirukta in Inclusive Global Histories of Technology, Science, Gender Equality, Inheritance, and an Argument of Consequence to the Chronology of some Smriti texts. Now, I'm not going to be touching upon the gender equality, inheritance, and Smriti text chronology in this presentation, given the time that we have. So the structure of my presentation is on top. Very quickly, I'll just touch upon some of my previous work, a few minutes on Nirukta's epoch, which is important to be able to set in context before I can go into the comparative aspects. The third section will be on significance for Indian history of writing and knowledge systems, as I see it at least. And the fourth and fifth being relevance for science and technology, respectively. Now, very quickly, these are some of my papers which are accessible on my academia profile. These are the two specific to Nirukta. This is the entire listing, and this is my academia profile, and all these papers can be downloaded from there. Now, coming to Nirukta's epoch. Now, we heard all our three previous speakers saying unequivocally that Yāska preceded Panini, right? That is, one might call the traditional view over millennia of Bharatiya Jnana Parampara. Now, the chronological epoch of Yāska's Nirukta has been analyzed in my first paper. In that analysis, which included some published points of view across 172 years, starting from Roth 1848 to Deshpande in 2020. After that analysis, it was shown that after Cardona's 1976 paper, at least three scholars, Bronkhorst, in at least three of his works, 81, 84, 2001, Kars, 1983, 98, and 2013, and Visigali in two papers in 2017, they have published views positing an epoch of after 400 BCE for Yāska's Nirukta. Okay. Now, I've shown in that paper that Kars' view, the Nirukta of Yāska probably dating from 4th century BCE, was not backed by any original chronological argument in any of these three papers of his, at least 2013, 98, and 1983. I have highlighted that there was a shift, there has been a shift in Visigali's position between 2017A and 2017B, where he moves from, quote, 6th to mid-3rd century BCE. From there, he moves to, which places Yāska around 250 BCE. And he says that this was a result of, to use his own words, inclination to accept Bronkhorst 2001. Now, in my paper, I've demonstrated through a philological analysis that the only original chronological argument from Bronkhorst that underpins his 2001 paper is found in his 1984 paper, which I've labeled B1984 in my first paper, which in turn cited Bronkhorst 1981, which I've labeled B1981. And I've shown that the argument, the only chronological argument that he's used, is something that seems hardly robust. And in fact, the basis for the argument that he uses, the occurrence and the absence of fleur, and I'll say where it occurs and where it doesn't occur. In fact, that same argument can actually be turned around on its head. Now, in the first paper, and I don't have the time to go through each one of these, I have first categorize the different scholars and where they have placed the epoch of Nirukta. Now, 200 BCE and below, I haven't come across anybody, at least after 1976, who has posited that period. Similarly, 201 to 249 BCE, I haven't come across anybody else. 250 to 300 BC, Bronkhorst, Visigali are amongst the people, like I mentioned. Kars places it in the 4th century BCE. David Zilberman has placed it in the 5th century BCE, as is Professor Madhav Deshpande in his entry on language in the Stanford, entries for this particular one. Now, Cardona places it in the 6th century BCE, along with Professor Upinder Singh. Now, in the 7th century, I haven't come across any publication. In the 8th century, when I wrote this paper, I hadn't come across, but I will touch upon this a little later. Now, Kapil Kapoorji places them in the 9th century BCE, and there are others who, based on their views on Patanjali, have expressed it at an earlier time. So there might be other views, but these are some of the views that I came across, at least after 1976, in a published format. Now, 1984 and 1981, essentially, as I understand, Bronkhorst is arguing that Panini's grammar does not know the retroflex consonant l. Okay, and he sees, and because the Nirukta actually has it, he uses this as a basis to actually argue that Nirukta should be looked as a, as something that followed Panini. Now, Panini is Ashtadhyayi specifically, and he builds actually on Mahindale's argument. Now, one way of summarizing the arguments that I've seen is that I've shown in my paper that that consonant l is actually seen in the Rigveda Suktam, and I have not come across anybody who dates that after 500 BCE. The same l is also found in Kaushitaki Upanishad, for which perhaps the most conservative estimates are between 401 BC to 600 BCE. This is by a scholar like Patrick Olivelle himself, who puts it in the 5th century and 6th century BCE. I'm not saying that's right, but I'm saying that even scholars like him put it at this period. Now, I haven't come across any arguments of Rigveda Suktam or Kaushitaki Upanishad to be after Panini, right? Despite the fact that they actually have this. Now, if they have it and they have been accepted to be pre-Paninian in that sense, I don't see why the Nirukta should be subjected to the absence of l in the Ashtadhyayi, for instance. Now, actually, it is not even perhaps correct to say that it is absent in all of Panini's works, or at least all of the works that are attributed to Panini, because I've shown in my paper that it is found even in the in Paniniya Shiksha. Okay, so it might not be found in the Ashtadhyayi, Sutra Patha, Dhatu Patha, Shabda Patha, or the Linganushasanam, but it is found in the Shiksha. So even on that count, the argument seems to be weak. Now, so to quote from my paper, now if the Rigveda Suktam and the Kaushitaki Upanishad can contain l and yet antedate Panini without being impacted by the absence of l in the Ashtadhyayi, Sutra Patha, Dhatu Patha, Shabda Patha, and the Linganushasanam, why should the absence of l in these necessitate that Yāska should be posterior to Panini, as Bronkhorst seems to be arguing? In view of 1 to 5 above, I don't see why the epoch of Yāska must be made hostage to what Bronkhorst sees as the absence of l in Panini's grammar. In fact, the presence of l in other texts before 400 BCE could perhaps lend credibility to arguments that place Nirukta before 400 BCE. Now, in the following views, in Cardona 2013 on Panini's epoch, he says he may well have thrived as early as 500 BCE, and Yāska's priority, where he also says more inclined to now to accept that Yāska preceded Panini, like all the three scholars who spoke before during this presentation also mentioned. If Cardona's views, for instance, are rigorous, then clearly 501 BCE serves at least as a provisional terminus antiquem. And this itself is conservative. It's a conservative view. But for the sake of argument, or at least for the purpose of this paper's argument, we can take this as a provisional terminus antiquem, meaning it can't be placed at an epoch after this, right? Now, I had mentioned that 8th century BC at the time that I was making the presentation. I didn't have anybody who had placed it, but Professor Bhatt, in this video of his, recent video in 2022, he actually has placed Yāska's Nirukta in the 8th century BC, certainly before Panini, therefore. And to quote him from the video, he says, दूसरी बात, अब यह जो शब्दकोश है, ये शब्दकोश को उठाकर उनमें आए हुए शब्दों की बारी बारी पर लेकर यास्क नाम के आचार्य ने ईसा पूर्व 8वीं शताब्दी में जब उपनिषदों की रचना पूर्ण हो गई, बाद में बारी बारी पर एक एक करके वेदांग की रचना शुरू हुई, तो यास्क ने ईसा पूर्व 8वीं शताब्दी में निरुक्त की रचना की और उन्होंने इन निघंटु में आए हुए शब्दों को लेकर उस पर अपनी एक कमेंट्री लिखी, एक भाष्य लिखा, उसका नाम है निरुक्त, unquote. So this background was necessary from a chronology point of view. Now, Professor Korada Subramaniam, who just spoke before this, he in fact responded to this paper, the specifics of this paper, and he has actually endorsed this view also. He at least responded very positively to it. There are others like Professor Kannan, Professor Irene Galston, and like I mentioned, Professor Korada Subramaniam would also respond. All this is in Bharatiya Vidvat Parishad, where the views can be fairly critical very quickly. So I just wanted to kind of set this as the base. Now, coming to the significance for Indian history of writing and knowledge systems. Now, this is a book, Manuscript Cultures Mapping the Field, which was published in 2014. Now, there's a paper in this book called Indian Manuscripts by a scholar who's considered influential in the whole field of Indology, specifically on different aspects of science in Indology. Now, he has written, and I quote, although writing was probably known to exist outside India before Ashoka, it has been compellingly argued that Ashoka created the first alphabetical writing specific to South Asia. Let me repeat that. He says that Ashoka created the first alphabetical writing specific to South Asia in order to promulgate his edicts, unquote. Now, this is curious that he should say this. I'm not sure if he has read the Nirukta or not. And I'm no scholar per se of Nirukta, but a casual reading of the Nirukta, or at least, if not casual, a slightly closer reading of the Nirukta, yielded the word Grantham in it. Okay, now let me blow that up a little bit so that it is clear. I had this in one of my other slides. Okay, I think I've deleted that particular slide. But if you can see in 120, Upadeshaya glayanto avare bilma grahanaya imam grantham. The word grantham is attested in 120. Now, Sarup in his translation has said, they by oral instruction handed down the hymns to later generations who were destitute of direct intuitive insight. The later generations, declining in power of oral communication, compiled the work and the auxiliary Vedic treatise in order to comprehend the meaning, right? So he also gives a contextual translation where he says there is a decline in the power of oral communication, and therefore this needed to be done. The word Grantham, in my view, clearly attests to, some interpretation of writing at least. And I think this does, given the epoch of Nirukta that we just saw, if we can at least conservatively look at Nirukta in the 6th century BCE, if not in 8th century BCE, as Professor Bhatt puts it, then somebody needs to explain how can these two, views coexist. How can a Nirukta talk about Grantham at that stage if Ashoka, who's supposed to have been after Nirukta, at least chronologically speaking, how can this view of, Dominic Vujastic exist? Now, there are other scholars who have written on the topic of writing in India before 250 BCE. Amongst them, the contributions of Jaiswal in 1933, Wakankar in 1968, Professor Subhash Kak in 94 and 2015, and Bhagwan Singh Ji in 1995. In my view, these are non-ignorable. So none of them have actually touched upon this point, and therefore I've added this to their work. But I think this is an important aspect when it comes to aspects of our own Indian history. Now, when it comes to knowledge system, it is now quite in vogue, certainly after the NEP, to talk about Indian knowledge systems. Now, two of the systems of knowledge that is attested in our texts, there are many knowledge systems. Two of the fairly comprehensive, again, they're not wholly comprehensive, but at least large systems of knowledge which are attested by name are Chaturdasha Vidya and Ashtadasha Vidya. Chaturdasha Vidya in Yajnavalkya Smriti, where you have Purana Nyaya Mimamsa Dharma Shastranga Mishritaha Veda Asthanani Vidyanam Dharmasya Cha Chaturdasha. And Ayurvedo Dhanurvedo Gandharvaschaivate Trayaha Arthashastram Chaturthantu Vidyaha Ashtadashaivataha, which is in the Vishnu Purana. Now, the word Vidyasthanam itself, if one looks at it, I haven't been able to find a reference, at least until now, which is earlier than what is found in the Nirukta, right? Again, in the same place. And this has been quoted by at least two scholars today, Tadidam Vidyasthanam Vyakaranasya Karsnyam. So clearly, any history that is being written on knowledge systems of India cannot ignore this reference of Vidyasthanam in the Niruktam. Now, relevance for science and relevance for science. If you look at this book, which was published by Oxford, Science Before Socrates, Parmenides, Anaxagoras, and the New Astronomy. This is by Daniel Graham. Now, these are actually a couple of papers which are also found from 2013 by the same author on the Oxford Science site. And it says, in the early 5th century BC, Parmenides recognized that the moon gets its light from the sun. Building on this insight, Anaxagoras developed a theory according to which the moon and other heavenly bodies were spherical masses and eclipses were caused by blocking of sun's light. Okay. Now, Parmenides' theory of heliophotism has important implications. The moon is opaque, and then 5 other aspects of it. Now, in my paper, I have shown even the fact that, of course, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy also credits Anaxagoras. It talks about Anaxagoras' epoch, says Anaxagoras, a Greek philosopher of 5th century BCE, right? So now you get a sense of when he lived, and we have seen the Daniel Graham, whose work was alluded to in the footnote 5, which I've referred to earlier. In a 2017 article, he re-emphasized the point that he made in the abstract of his 2013 book, which we saw earlier, that Anaxagoras embraced Parmenides' idea, right? What was the idea? About the reflection of the sun's light by moon. Now, in the Nirukta, now if this is the cutting edge, of whom heliophotism is to be ascribed to, right, which is Parmenides and Anaxagoras in that order, now I think that needs to be revised in view of what we see in the Niruktam. And the Niruktam actually is referring to Vajasena Samhita, Shatapada Brahmana, and the Taittiriya Samhita. Now, this is the particular reference. Aditya Tosya Deeptir Bhavati Sushumnaha Surya Rashmi Chandrama Gandharvaha, right? And these are the references. Professor Paturi, with your permission, I'll take a few minutes more so that I can just close out these sections. Now, this particular, the translation of that particular reference that we just saw by Sarup, that moreover, a ray of sun illuminates the moon, that the illumination of the moon is caused by the sun is to be established by the following. Sushumna is the ray of sun, the moon is the holder. This too is a Vedic passage. Now, this is in the Niruktam, and Niruktam is pointing to earlier Vedic texts. Now, if globally heliophotism is going to be ascribed to, Parmenides or Anaxagoras, then I think Nirukta and the works that the Nirukta is referring to should definitely be considered and included in any inclusive history of heliophotism. Now, Professor Subhash Kak has actually read this paper like Professor Korada Subramaniam has, and this was his view on this particular paper. Now, in addition to astronomy, now if Sarup's translation of Kamsam can be admitted, he has translated it as white copper. Now, if this can be admitted, and if there is, and he's not the only one who has translated it as white copper, even Apte's dictionary actually includes this particular translation. Though there are other words, there are other meanings also given to Kamsam. But if, and Kane and, Apte and Sarup are not the only ones who have done it. Even the Monier-Williams online dictionary actually includes white copper as one of the meanings of Kamsa. Now, if that can be admitted without a problem, now, if you look at the history of white copper, it is actually the earliest attribution that I've come across. White copper is actually cupro-nickel. Now, cupro-nickel has been variously attributed to the Chinese traditions, starting from at least 4th century AD and going as far back as 300 BCE. All the references are there in my paper on which are the scholars who are citing this or which are the sites. Now, 300, at least its first known use was in China in 300 BCE, is the earliest that I've seen it being attributed. Now, if that is the case, then I've argued, and as I put across in my paper, I have not come across an attribution either textual or of the actual usage of the metal itself earlier than around 300 BCE for Pakthong, which is cupro-nickel or white copper. If what Nirukta attests is indeed as Sarup has translated white copper, then in light of the conservative epoch of Nirukta seen earlier, this attestation would be, in my view, the basis of a new chapter in an inclusive global history of metallurgy, specifically white copper, one whose basis, though, needs to be more thoroughly engaged with and critically by an academic enterprise, to which this section would perhaps at least be an early contribution, if not the trigger. Now, moving on from science to technology, so there is this book called Greek and Roman Technology, a source book of translated Greek and Roman texts. Okay, the primary author is Andrew Sherwood. Now, this is the second edition, the cover that you're seeing. In the first edition of this book, you see the following, that was published in 2003. Now, kindling fires by focusing sunlight. This is specifically listed as a separate subsection 2.4 in this book. The above mentioned subsection is repeated with the same title, subsection number, etc. in the 2019 version that you see on the screen right now. It says, and I quote, Aristophanes, clouds, 771, 773, Strepsiads, quote, now then, have you seen in the druggist shops that stone, beautiful, transparent, by which they kindle fire? Now, Socrates is responding to this by saying, you mean the burning glass. Now, from what we have seen, now this literally is what is the basis for claiming that this particular way of using sunlight to actually burn aspects, or calling it burning glass, this is attributed to the Greek tradition. Okay, and this gets pride of place in even histories of optics, etc. Now, from what we have just seen, it is clear that kindling fires by focusing sunlight using a burning glass is considered worthy of being chronicled in the 21st century by influential global publishers like Routledge in such titles. Now, this is repeated also in the Encyclopedia of Materials science and technology. I'm not going into that detail, but if the Wikipedia page also, for instance, for burning glass is in sync with the excerpts for the source book and the encyclopedia cited above, given that amongst the names mentioned in its first two paragraphs, it includes all these names actually: Pliny the Elder, Plutarch, Aristophanes, Archimedes, etc. Now, if one were to on face value take for granted that the accuracy and truth value of all citations included in this section, if we are to assume that, I have not verified each of these, but let's say they are all true, it appears that the earliest published textual evidence for a burning glass is from a play, The Clouds, attributed to Aristophanes and dated to 424 BCE. Now, in my view, this attribution again now needs to be relooked if one is looking at the global scenario in light of what we find in the Nirukta and the conservative terminus antiquum for it. The Nirukta has in 723 the following reference: Aditye kamsam va manin va parimrajya pratisware yatra. I'm not reading the whole thing right now. The word kamsam over here, as Sarup has translated, quote, a person holds a polished piece of white copper or crystal, focusing the sun rays in a place where there is some dry cow dung without touching it. It blazes forth, and this very terrestrial fire is produced. So you see over here burning glass, using sunlight is used as a way to attribute that in Greek and Roman technology in their source books. This is kind of quoted. So I don't see why the Nirukta should not be therefore included in inclusive global histories. Now, in this article that I wrote after these papers in Hindi, I've written उपरोक्त बिंदुओं से खगोल विज्ञान, धातु विज्ञान और प्रकाशिकी विज्ञान के वैश्विक इतिहास और भारत के वर्णमाला लेखन और ज्ञान प्रणालियों के इतिहास के लिए निरुक्त का महत्व स्पष्ट होना चाहिए. जहां तक मैं देख पाया हूं, बिफोर माय पेपर्स, इनके पहले किसी भी प्रकाशन ने उपयुक्त तुलनात्मक विश्लेषणों के आधार पर उपयुक्त मामलों को प्रस्तुत नहीं किया है. So with that, I will end my presentation